Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in this video, I ask that you brace yourself because I'm going to go on a bit of a rant. Now, full disclosure, I'm somewhat reluctant to try this. I know myself. I know how I can get whenever I talk about certain topics. And when it comes to superhero comics and superhero media in general, I know I can talk a lot. And since that happens to be the main basis of this rant, I expect to come off as overly animated at times. But I am willing to take that chance because I think this is a relevant topic, especially among fellow fans of superhero comics. And it'll likely be even more relevant in future superhero movies because it has to do with the Avengers and the X-Men and what makes them distinct in the world of superhero media. Now, I'm bringing this topic up for many reasons. And it's not just because these two are among the biggest franchises in all of superhero comics. I actually want to touch on it because I feel like there's always been a bit of a disconnect between these two teams. And that disconnect is only going to become more prominent once the X-Men enter the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And whatever form that takes, I imagine it will generate plenty of discussions and controversies. But the one that's relevant to this particular context has to do with how the Avengers and the X-Men are perceived in their respective worlds. If you've read the comics and seen the movies, you probably already know that dynamic on some levels. It goes like this. The Avengers are a team of superpowered beings. The source of their powers varies, from super soldier serums to gadgets to gamma radiation to alien science gone wrong. But whatever their source, they're still Earth's mightiest heroes, and they're celebrated as such. The X-Men are a team of superpowered beings as well, but the source of their powers is largely the same. They're all mutants. They all inherited the X gene, and that gene gives them their powers. It may take many forms, be it telepathy, optic blasts, healing factors, and flight, but they're still heroes in that they try to do good with those powers and save the world whenever it needs saving. And yet, they're not celebrated like the Avengers. Instead, they're often targets for hatred, bigotry, and even violence, sometimes from the same people they try to save. Now, that is not a trivial difference. And that difference has been highlighted on many occasions, both within major stories and among fans. Hell, I can remember this sparking heated debates in the pre-internet days, some of which became shouting matches within comic book stores. But I feel like most of those debates often devolve into who thinks which team is cooler, or just fans standing up for their favorite characters. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it doesn't offer much in terms of real substance. I don't deny that I have fallen into that trap myself. I've also made it clear that I'm a big X-Men fan, and I will be inclined to defend them more than most. But in this case, I'm going to try and be balanced in ranting on this issue because I feel like even the comics lately have been avoiding it. And I do worry that the MCU will avoid it too. And in doing so, it'll miss some key details that make the Avengers and the X-Men so distinct. To appreciate those distinctions, just take a step back and look at what kind of battles each team usually fights. For the Avengers, it's usually pretty basic. Just watch the first Avengers movie, or read some of the recent Avengers comics. Most of those battles are against these big, larger-than-life threats that most people, and most nations for that matter, aren't equipped to handle. Invasions by shape-shifting aliens, wars waged by renegade gods, plots by nefarious organizations bent on world domination, attacks by mystical monsters cut loose on accident or on purpose. These are the kind of threats that the Avengers take on. This is what they're built for, and these are the kinds of issues where you need the best and the mightiest. You're not dealing with your run-of-the-mill street crime, bank robbers, or even master criminals. These are all genuine existential threats, the kind that you cannot afford to lose. Now, the nature of those threats may change, and the Avengers themselves may face a lot of personal issues along the way. But that's exactly what makes them so much fun. It's also what makes them so compelling as characters. With the X-Men, the stakes can be just as high, and they often are when you're dealing with the likes of Apocalypse, Nimrod, and the Phoenix Force. But that's not really where the X-Men have their greatest impact. Because what makes them heroes isn't just that they're willing to use their powers to save the world. It has much more to do with them protecting and preserving their place in that world. And by that, I don't just mean them, the X-Men, I mean them as in the entire mutant race. It's by far one of the most important elements of their story. The X-Men emerged in a world that was grown to hate, fear, and mistrust mutants. People see a mutant and they don't see a future member of the Avengers, they just see some random person manifesting superpowers in a way that's potentially dangerous. They're not the result of some fluke experiment, some divine heritage, or some bite from a radioactive animal. It's just so chaotic and unpredictable, and it often first manifests in teenagers, who tend to be chaotic and unpredictable by default. And in that sense, the difference in perception kind of makes sense. I mean, who among the general public wouldn't be scared if some teenage boy just randomly started shooting lasers from his eyes in the middle of school? Sort of like what happened with Cyclops in X-Men Apocalypse. And whenever Marvel fans talk, argue, or rant about the X-Men, that point often gets made, usually as a mean to frame mutants within a particular context. But I also think that context often misses the bigger picture, as well as the larger message that the X-Men and mutants represent. For one, it underscores the fact that mutants never asked for their powers. They never strived to be superheroes or anything of the sort. And they don't have any control over what kind of powers they get or how they manifest, no more than anyone has control over the color of their skin or their blood type. That lack of agency is key when contrasted with the heroes in the Avengers. Yes, characters like Spider-Man and the Hulk got their powers by accident, but the nature of those accidents were usually one-time events. Unless, of course, you factor in the multiverse, but that's another issue entirely. The overarching point here is that the makeup of the Avengers is unique, populated by characters who become heroes under very unique circumstances. And it's because they're so unique that they don't always get along as individuals. They don't even get along as a team half the time. But that just makes their ability to function when the going gets tough that much more dramatic. I feel like the first Avengers movie captured that spirit perfectly. It had a threat that nobody else could confront. Individuals with varied powers and abilities through various means all coming together, all assembling to save a world that needed saving. And future Avengers movies, right up through Avengers Endgame, really embrace that spirit, albeit to varying degrees of success. For the X-Men, well, this is where I'll need to do a little more ranting, because while the movies and the comics do a great job of getting the superhero element of their story down, it's the stuff that sets them apart from the Avengers that seems to be getting lost. Yes, they're heroes on paper, and yes, they save the day on a regular basis. But the way they do it and the way they approach it, it almost feels too similar to the Avengers. And when they're not saving the day, they're just trying to avoid extinction, which sometimes involves them having to fight other superhero teams in the process. Since 2012, the X-Men have actually come to blows with both the Avengers and the Inhumans. And the stakes have always been for their own survival. It's dramatic and flashy, but again, it misses the forest from the trees with respect to what the X-Men stand for. And as a result, X-Men stories of the past 25 years seem to fall into two categories: having to act as top-tier superheroes in the mold of the Avengers, or just having to be the ones to save the entire mutant race from extinction. And there tends to be very little in between. Things like confronting the real bigotry that mutants face, let me those who aren't veteran X-Men, that's becoming increasingly rare. And other elements like protecting mutants who don't want to be X-Men or just want to live their lives, those stories do still happen, but not nearly as often as they used to. But it was those kinds of stories that really helped make the X-Men what they are. Looking back at stories like God Loves, Man Kills, or E is for Extinction, and even parts of the original Stan Lee Jack Kirby run, the battles they fought had that element. It wasn't just about the X-Men saving the world. It was about the X-Men protecting other mutants like them, mutants who either didn't have powers that could protect them or weren't trained to take on an army of Sentinels. That is a critical detail to the X-Men that sets them apart, because those aren't the kinds of battles that the Avengers usually fight. And if they actually did, it just wouldn't fit, because those larger themes about being different in a hateful world just wouldn't work as well. Yes, there are still people who resent the Avengers and don't trust them, but again, they're a collection of remarkable individuals, whereas mutants are a minority class of people, only a fraction of which are capable X-Men. It's much easier to have bigoted hatred towards them than it would be for the Avengers, or any other superhero team for that matter. Because not all superheroes are mutants, but all X-Men are mutants, and mutants, like it or not, can be dangerous. That leads right to another key distinction, and one that often comes up among people who love to whine about superhero media. They'll see the first X-Men movie, see what mutants are capable of, and end up siding with the likes of Senator Kelly or William Stryker. They'll say something along the lines of, being a mutant is nothing like being a real minority. Shooting lasers out of your eyes, manipulating thoughts, walking through walls. That shit is dangerous. And if it's randomly showing up in teenagers, people should be afraid, and the government should do something. Now, when I hear this, I want to bang my head against the nearest wall, because it misses the entire fucking point, while also failing to grasp the dramatic weight of the X-Men's heroism. Because yes, mutants can be dangerous, but the key word there is can. There is still a person behind that mutation. Someone with their own thoughts, feelings, hopes, and dreams. They didn't ask to be a mutant, no more than they asked to have their hair color or blood type. This was just the cards they were dealt at birth. And the fear of what they might do with those cards is where the real parallels come in. Just look at any history of minority relations. Hell, just look at the current situation we have now with the LGBTQ+ community. A lot of it comes back to what certain minorities might do if they're tolerated or empowered. Now, what they're actually doing. That fear is, by definition, irrational, because it doesn't see the person. It only sees the potential danger. With the X-Men and mutants, people don't see the individuals or the characters. They see their powers and how they're using them. That's it. That's how they're defined. That's how things like mutant hunting sentinels or mutant response teams are justified. They see one mutant do significant damage with their abilities, they just assume all mutants are just as dangerous. We see that play out in the first two X-Men movies. We see it play out in Days of Futures Past and the Dark Phoenix saga. It all comes back to the X-Men being mutants and mutants being hated and feared. But with the Avengers, it often comes back to the idea that these aren't just trusted heroes, these are uniquely special individuals. Not a group, a population, or some amorphous force. They are each individual people who wield immense power and carry themselves with larger-than-life personalities. Yet they choose to use all that power to protect the world. That's what makes them heroes. For the X-Men, they're all special individuals too, each with their own quirks, issues, passions, and personas. But they cannot escape what they are. They cannot change the fact that they're a mutant. Even so, they choose to take this accident of birth and use it to do good, to save the day, to protect others, even if they're hated and feared. Moreover, the X-Men play the part of heroes so that other mutants who aren't inclined to fight killer robots in yellow spandex, can still live their lives as best they can. You can liken that to someone like Batman, who fights crime to prevent others from suffering the same traumatic loss that he did. Or even Spider-Man, who does the same to prevent others from losing loved ones. They choose to be heroes so that others can live better lives than their own. It's at the heart of Charles Xavier's dream. And yes, that dream still matters. In recent years, the comics somewhat moved away from the dream. For a while, the dream was basically dead, mostly because mutants were constantly on the brink of extinction. First from the events of House of M, and then again with the Terrigen Mists. But eventually, the dream evolved. These days, the X-Men comics are really leaning into the concept of mutants having their own distinct identity. They've gone on to create their own homeland in Krakoa, complete with their own culture. They've also started dealing with humanity in a larger, more geopolitical sense. Now personally, I love how the comics have let the X-Men and mutants evolve to mean something more than just a source of superpowers. But at the same time, it still feels like it overlooks some of those distinctions I mentioned. And sometimes, it has them default to the role of generic heroes in the mold of the Avengers. Having that happen every once in a while isn't a bad thing, But again, the X-Men are not the Avengers, and treating them as such undermines what makes each team work as well as they do. That's something I really hope Marvel Studios highlights whenever the X-Men enter the MCU. I think there will be a temptation to just make the X-Men like the Avengers, but with mutants. And if certain actors or actresses don't have their contracts renewed, that temptation will only intensify. But even in those circumstances, I believe Kevin Feige and co. need to resist that temptation. Despite their many flaws, the Fox movies made an effort to keep the X-Men's heroics tied to the larger mutant issues. But if mutants in the MCU just become another source of superpowers, then we're not going to get an X-Men team that feels like X-Men. We'll just get a team of superheroes who happen to be called the X-Men. And personally, I think they deserve better than that. They don't need to fill the role of the Avengers, because the Avengers already do that and they do it well. Even with the newer legacy characters, the spirit that emerged in that first Avengers movie is going strong. And there's no reason why they can't keep assembling for the battles that only Earth's mightiest heroes can fight. On top of that, there's also no reason why the X-Men can't be heroes in their own right at the same time. They each want to save the world, but the stakes for each team are very different. And both teams are at their best when they embrace those differences. One need not become more like the other to become relevant or cool. They just need to lean into what makes them so iconic after all these years. And with all that being said, I think I'll end this rant here. If you've made it this far, I appreciate it. Now, I apologize if I've droned on a bit, but being such a huge fan of both the X-Men and the Avengers, I wanted to put this sentiment out there. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.